So during the 2-year period that I was with UL, I actually worked from my home in Salt Lake City, and MasterControl is just down the street from me. So I've watched the company grow, and I thought it would be a really great relationship. So the reason that we're very excited about it is you may be aware that UL does a lot of things. We do certification work, notified body, medical device, and other like materials testing and so forth. So kind of you name it in the regulated industry, and we do it. Today I'm going to cover the new unique device identification rule. It applies to medical devices and combination products in the United States, so we'll talk more about the scope of the rule. We've worked with some clients on Class 3 implementation for the rule on their products, so we'll talk a little bit about lessons learned on that, tips for integration of the UDI, some of the requirements that will be coming down in the EU, and the medical device regulation when it comes out, and then planning for UDI when launching product. So a little bit of background. The FDA actually took a look at some of the problems with defining where medical devices were and how the problems were being reported and how medical devices could be tracked, and they found that there was quite a problem, and they commissioned a study to be done, which was released. The findings were released in March of 2006. And at that time, they found that there were about 10 different tracking mechanisms that medical providers were using to track devices and where their patients were and who had what. And they found that there were some cases where they were unable to locate the patients that received certain implants. There was no centralized way for the FDA to learn of product issues and how to really trend what was going on in the device industry. As an example, they talked about 66,000 adverse events that were reported in 2007, and out of those, 60% of the products could not be tied to any meaningful identifier. So the U.S. Congress took a look at what the pharma industry was doing to track for pharmaceuticals, and they directed the FDA to publish a rule for medical devices. The rule has certain purposes that were attached with it. One of those is, of course, the tracing of medical devices more efficiently and really having a way to capture information about devices on a more efficient basis so that it gives FDA a chance to monitor certain types of products and learn more about the kinds of problems that they create in the medical world. And the goal then was to reduce medical errors. The adverse event reporting will be enhanced by use of the rule. The site that you have to record medical devices in will be searchable by the public, so the public will be able to go in and learn information about the types of medical devices as well. It will fight against counterfeiting because companies are going to be assigned certain barcodes that they have to use to identify each of these devices, and so counterfeiters will not be able to as easily put counterfeit product on the marketplace. And then one of the hopes that the FDA had was to lead to some type of a medical identification system globally. And the whole idea is really about post-market tracking and giving information about the use of medical devices. So what is the UDI? It's actually a two-part system. The device identification part of it is a mandatory fixed part of the system, and it identifies who the labeler is and the specific model or version of the device that is assigned that particular identification. The labeler can be the person who manufactures the device, but it can also be the person who is responsible for the final labeling when it goes on to the marketplace. So OEMs or something of that effect could also be determined to be a labeler. The second part of the rule is a production identification portion. And it's a variable part that identifies such things as the lot or batch number or serial number, expiration or manufacturing dates, and then some specific information about types of products such as tissue-based products or cellular or so forth. The FDA did mandate a particular date format with the UDI requirements, and so it's a little bit different format than some of the ISO standards require, but it is definitely an FDA requirement, and so it really requires a 4-digit year and then a 2-digit month and a 2-digit day, and it has to be presented with hyphens separating the elements. And for some reason the FDA is being very, very emphatic about this. So whenever there's a date that's included on a product that's supposed to be brought to the attention of the users of the medical device, it has to be presented in that format. This is an example of a label that's produced under the UDI requirements. It is for informational purposes only. It comes from a guidance document that the FDA has put out about implementing the UDI, but it shows then the brand name of the product. You're required to have the GMDN code, so the global medical device nomenclature code has to appear on the labeling. If there is a size of the product that is, if there's more than one size available of the particular product, then you have to state the size on the label. The catalog number, lot number, expiration information, the device count, and then other information on the label such as storage conditions, whether it's single use or not, the labeler information and who the contact information is, and then the actual device identification itself. This is required to be in machine readable and human readable format. Yes?
You said that the storage conditions are placed as pictograms.
Say again?
The storage conditions are printed here as pictograms. Are there some official pictograms that have to be used?
Excuse me.
Because I know from the chemical industry, the storage conditions are not as pictograms, but they should be written. And each company may have its own set of pictograms for that.
These particular pictograms are provided in an ISO standard for medical devices.
Okay, medical devices have a standard for that?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, and so who needs to follow the rule is anybody who puts a medical device on the market in the United States. And of course, medical devices under FDA definitions also can include combination products where there's part pharmaceutical and part medical device included in the product. There are some exemptions for Class 1 devices. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a few minutes, but the FDA has published a list of product codes of Class 1 devices that do not need to have the UDI on them at all. And then there are some other things that Class 1 devices can do short of the full compliance to the rule. Again, the person who's responsible for placing the medical device on the U.S. market is considered to be the labeler. So again, it can be the manufacturer, or it can be an importer or a distributor, or whoever has their name on the product when it goes out to the public to use. The labeler is responsible to ensure that the UDI provisions are met, so it is the labeler's responsibility for compliance. And of course, importers into the U.S. also have to meet the UDI requirements. Products that are manufactured for use outside of the U.S. don't need to comply. So if it's a U.S. manufacturer and they're only going to send the products outside of the U.S., they don't have to comply with the U.S. requirements. So as I mentioned, Class 1 products don't need to include the production identifier. And if there is a UPC already in use on Class 1 products, that will suffice for the unique identification. Individual single-use products that are distributed in the same package don't need to be marked individually. So the package itself can bear the UDI, and the individual single-use devices don't need to have it. If there are devices that were manufactured prior to the compliance date that the FDA set for the particular class of product, then you don't have to go into inventory and pull them out and remark them. That exemption only lasts for 3 years after the compliance date. So any product that's in inventory longer than 3 years then would have to be pulled and relabeled. And then, as I mentioned, the GMP exempt Class 1 devices, FDA published a list. These are the products that are very low risk, and they don't need to have the UDI on them at all. If software is a standalone medical device, it requires a UDI on it. That UDI can be presented either with an information page that comes up when the software is started, or some type of an easy readable text when a menu command. There is no requirement for software that's part of a medical device. So only if it's a standalone package of medical software. So the dates for compliance, it's a complicated set of dates. The first requirement date has already passed, and that was all the Class 3 devices. The rule actually became effective in the United States in September of 2013. And so the manufacturers of Class 3 devices, which are the highest risk devices in the U.S., had 1 year to comply. And after that 1 year, they had to have the UDI on their labels and packages, and also standalone software that was Class 3 software. The U.S. has a certain classification system that has to be followed. There's a number of regulations that the FDA has issued for each type of product for you to determine whether it's a Class 3 product or not. But basically the Class 3 products are the high-risk products that would include life-supporting and life-sustaining type products. 2 years after the publication, so September of this year, the Class 3 life-supporting and life-sustaining products have to have a permanent UDI on them. So that means that not only on the package and labeling of the product, but also on the device itself, there has to be some method that permanently has that UDI marking on it. And then the labels and packaging of Class 2 and Class 1 or unclassified products that are life-sustaining and life-supporting have to have the UDI on their labeling. So again, during this year, Class 3 life-sustaining has to have the permanent UDI, and then the rest of the classes have to have the UDI on their label. 3 years after the publication, or September of next year, then Class 2 devices need to have the UDI on the labels and packaging. And then Class 3s have to have a permanent UDI on them. So you'll see that the Class 3 here had to be Class 3 life-sustaining and life-supporting devices had to have a permanent. Here, Class 3 of all other products, the UDI has to be permanent. And then the Class 2 standalone software. Then in 5 years after publication, or in 2018, the Class 1 products have to have the UDI on them. And so that would, of course, be the Class 1 products that are not exempt from the UDI. Class 2 products that are intended for reuse and reprocessed have to have a permanent UDI. So here, the Class 2 products had to just have a UDI label. 2 years after that, if they're reusable and reprocessed devices, they have to have permanent UDI on those. There are some exemptions for that permanent UDI marking. They're very high requirement exemptions. It would include things like it not being technologically feasible to permanently mark the product, or if it would create some sort of a safety hazard for a permanent marking to be on the product. And then finally, in 2020, all Class 1 or unclassified devices that are intended to be reused and reprocessed also have to bear a permanent UDI. So it's a table that has to be referred back to often for compliance if it's a company that manufactures various types and classes of products. Things that we've learned as we've helped companies with their UDI process, I'm going to say, number one, be careful of pitfalls. Poor planning around UDI implementation. It's a complicated process. It requires a well thought out project plan. It requires proper allocation of resources from the company, and if there are not adequate resources, then you really need to bring in some kind of help from the outside to get it done. There is a lot of change that will occur in the organization. There is a number of manufacturing processes that could be impacted. We'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes about some of the other changes to the quality system that will occur as a result of implementing the UDI. There are some amendments to other parts of quality system requirements that have to be taken into account. And then if there are multi-site organizations, it's very critical for project planning and deciding how the reporting mechanism into the global database that the FDA has organized will be done by these multi-site organizations. So some things to keep in mind for project management is, number one, the product assessment itself. Really is important to identify and prioritize the types of products that the company has and which ones are going to require which types of UDIs. You'll need to collect a lot of information about each of the devices. There's product attributes that have to be reported into the global database, and these attributes have to be identified by the company. Some of them are mandatory and some of them are up to the company's discretion. And then, of course, developing a project plan. Having a labeling and artwork assessment is required. You would have to look at current label artwork and determine if the UDI requirements are met with what's already in place, or how to meet those requirements if not. And of course, there's always a real estate problem on the labels. Is there enough room on my label to include the information that I have to include. You have to determine what types of packaging levels that you have and how that is impacted by the UDI rule. And then you would need to assess current processes against what needs to be in place in order to implement the rule in the future. What procedures need to be created and which ones need to be modified. And then the Global Unique Device Identification Database, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but this is what the FDA has set up to report all the types of medical devices into. It's not a requirement that you record every device that's manufactured, just the types of device that you do manufacture and what product attributes that you've attached to those devices. So it's a big job. At any rate, you have to determine how you're going to report that to the FDA. There's a couple of different methodologies that it can be reported. And then actually entry of the data into the database. And I am working a bit with MasterControl. They've identified some ways to help with the compliance for UDI, and we have some ongoing meetings talking about some compliance help with the UDI requirements. So we call it the GUDID. It's part of the UDI system, and it's actually the part that the FDA is the most emotional about, making sure that products get reported correctly into this database. Some of the key concepts of the GUDID are the accounts themselves, who the users are, what their roles are, and then the device identification record, life cycle information. So again, this includes all the different types of attributes that you assign to your products. It includes packaging configurations, and there, as I mentioned, the two different ways of submitting information into the GUDID. The FDA, once that information is submitted, will then review it to see whether it's all correct or not. Some of the things that will cause the FDA to reject information that gets entered is whether there's not a complete conformance with UDI requirements. When you enter the information into the GUDID, you have to include what the market clearance information is. So if there's a pre-market approval number or a 510K number, you have to include that. If you're exempt from pre-market clearance, then you say why you're exempt in this database. And if the device is not manufactured or sold in the U.S. So in other words, they said not manufactured or sold. It really should be not manufactured and sold. You can manufacture a medical device in the U.S. and sell it out of the U.S. and not have to report. You can manufacture a medical device out of the U.S. and not sell it in the U.S. and you don't have to report. But if you manufacture it outside of the U.S. and sell it in the U.S., then it must be reported. There are 3 accreditation agencies that the FDA has recognized that can issue barcodes for medical devices. And so as long as those issuing agencies stay in good standing with the FDA, you can submit your information to the GUDID. If one of them loses, if you're using one of them that loses their accreditation with the FDA, then you can no longer use that issuing agency and you would have to move to a different one. If that occurs, then the FDA will give you some implementation time to change to a new agency. So what are the things that are required to be reported in the GUDID? It would include, of course, the device identification portion. If you have a product that you change the UDI on because you've made some changes to the product, then you have to report what the previous UDI number was. If there is a requirement to bear a permanent UDI, you have to say that the device identifier is identical to the label, or what the device identification is that appears as permanent marking. So what this means is that if it's not feasible to permanently mark a device with the very same information that occurs on the label, you can permanently mark it in a different way, but you have to show the FDA how those two marks tie together. And that's done in the GUDID. You have to show the trade or brand name of the device, the version or model number of it, and whether it's a sterile product. You have to identify if it contains latex in the device itself or packaging that would come in contact with a user or patient. Whether a patient can safely be exposed to the various types of imaging technology. If the device is available in more than one size, what that size and unit of measure is. The type of production identifier that appears. So you have to define for the FDA whether you're going to use lot numbers, batch numbers, serial numbers, expiration dates, manufacturing dates. All those variable parts of the UDI have to be identified in the GUDID. And then, as I mentioned, you have to tell what the pre-market submission number is or whether it's exempt. There is a product listing that you have to give to the FDA when you manufacture medical devices, and so you include that device listing number, and then the GMDN code and the number of devices that are contained in the package. Besides these 15 or 16 attributes that you report to the GUDID, there are another, I'm going to say 50 or 60 attributes that you can choose whether you associate your device to those attributes or not. The FDA has published a whole spreadsheet that identifies all the different types of attributes that you can consider and why you may want to consider them for your device, and it's all part of the guidance documents that the FDA has published. So again, the UDI compliance really has to be looked at as a complete solution. There's 3 aspects to it. There's the labeling aspect, and this is one of the mistakes that companies make, is that they think, oh, it's just about putting a label on my product. But it's much more than that. You have to consider the fact that you will be creating prototype labeling, identifying labeling vendors or how you're going to create your labels, and then create the labels for the products. And then there's the informatics aspect, which is the reporting to the GUDID, collecting all the information that has to be used to populate those records, and then selecting what the GUDID interface method will be. The FDA requires that you choose one individual and one only who is their primary contact with regards to the UDI. And the idea here is that the FDA wants only one throat to choke. If there's problems with the submissions, they only want to have to go to one person. You can set up other users in the GUDID, people that will enter information, but you have just that one agent that's named. And then there is the process aspect, so all the things that will be impacted within the organization in the manufacturing procedures, labeling procedures and equipment, evaluation of policies and procedures and SOPs, and see what needs to be updated and created. And then it actually, in a lot of cases of clients that I've worked with, creates an opportunity for them to improve their quality management system because it reaches so many places into the quality management system. It's an opportunity to look and see where improvements can be made. Other regulations that are affected by the UDI rule include, of course, the labeling itself, but then there's the medical device reporting and reports of records and approvals, records, corrections and removals. So if a company has some sort of a field problem and they either have to recall the product or they have to send out some kind of field correction, they have to report that to the FDA and they have to include the UDI information in those reports. It gives the FDA particular device recall authority more than they have just by really analyzing the GUDID and seeing the types of products that are in there and matching that against the medical device reporting. And then it touches the medical device, the quality system regulation, just because it requires the application of the UDI during the product manufacturing and design controls and so forth. And then tracking requirements and post-market surveillance are impacted as well. So what about Europe and the rest of the world? You are probably aware, but the European Commission did issue a recommendation after the initial draft of the US FDA final rule was published. And they issued this recommendation in April of 2013, asking the member states to think about what can be done to incorporate a global unique identification system in Europe. And they asked the member states to avoid the risk of incompatible or divergent systems. So really come together and find out a way that we can do the same sort of thing the FDA is doing and have a reporting mechanism that will allow us to be consistent with what the US is doing. It's contemplated that when the medical device regulation is published, that it will require a device identification as part of that regulation, and that the UDI database will be used for the reporting, much as the US GUDID database is used. Other places around the globe, China is looking into a UDI system. They will probably develop their own standards. They'll probably be based roughly on the European or the US standards, but we know that China usually comes out with their own standards. GS1 is one of the FDA approved issuing agencies, and GS1 is used already quite a bit in China, and you'll see 90 to 95% in Japan. So those markets will probably go with the GS1 for their global systems. India is moving towards identification of medical devices. Korea also is. Turkey already has a database in place. They've had it for a number of years. They use a different nomenclature system than the GMDN, but it's basically a UDI that they have in place. And then Canada, Australia, and Brazil have stated that they're going to watch and see what happens with the US system and perhaps the European system. There is a thought that once the medical device regulation is issued, that there'll be some implementation time in Europe to comply with the device identification requirements that will be in that regulation. The thinking currently is that by the year 2016, the regulation will be issued and full compliance will be required by 2021. So summary, our experience with the FDA, it's new. We're learning industry is learning, and actually FDA is learning. They're taking a lot of input from industry as a lot of questions are coming up about the practical aspects of implementing UDI, and they are being very responsive to questions and suggestions about clarifying and issuing guidance documents. It is important to start early. If you have a Class 2 product that's for sale on the U.S. market, you really need to start immediately if you're not already started. It does require upper management and IT support, very important, that someone from upper management sponsors a project for getting the requirements in place, having a project plan with internal commitments, really getting down to a product analysis, gathering all of that data together about all the products that are being manufactured by an organization, very important. And then understanding that there will be changes that have to be made in order to comply. So, any questions? Okay, and I'll be here for the duration of your conference here, so if you come up with any, please see me. Thank you.